To begin, we have a movie of the week. So I will go ahead and hit the introduction for that. Alrighty, so yet again this week, as has sort of become habit, we're actually saying it's movie of the week, and we will sort of be talking about a movie, but really it's a pretense to get into a book franchise, uh, which seems to be about what's about to happen. So, what are we talking about this week, Caleb?
Well, we're discussing the film Ender's Game, which
Yes.
leads us into the Ender saga,
Hmm.
which I have to be honest with you, I'm blanking on what it actually is called at this point in time because as the author has released more and more books,
Hmm.
the name of it has changed a few times from trilogy to quartet to
Uh,
quintet to I think it's just now called the Ender saga.
there you go. Alrighty. And so how far back do you go with the book series? I suppose we should. Um, I guess we could give a plot summary, although I don't want to give. I mean, I don't think major spoilers are necessary.
Yeah.
Um, but we could
Well,
probably
the book
talk about.
series has been out for some time, so
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think the spoiler um, embargo has been lifted on the
right,
books.
sure,
Uh, the film, let's see, when did the film come out? 2013.
yeah, yeah.
So,
Now,
go ahead.
yeah, so I've only read the first book. You've read more books, so you're going to have a little bit more knowledge on the themes and the story than I do. But we do know a little bit. Oh, Ash says, "What if we want to read them?" Well, the only spoiler I would be worried about giving away is the twist at the end of the first book. But I don't think it would hurt anything to give the basic overall plot idea. Um, I don't think that would ruin the book for you at all. It would probably make it more interesting.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so I've read the first book. You've read more. And then there's the movie. Hey,
Yeah.
Dragon Fist. We got our two regulars in the chat already. Welcome, welcome. Um, yes. So, how would you describe sort of the overarching plot, and how do you think the movie did in terms of summarizing it? I can give my take, but I'll get yours first. I think you have more exposure.
So for me, I actually started with the movie again.
Mm-hmm.
This was another series. I think I referenced last week, The Giver.
Mm-hmm.
I started with the movie.
Yeah.
Harry Potter started with the movie. Lord of the Rings started with the movie. So yeah, we have a trend here.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so kind of a brief synopsis of the film. Um, these hostile aliens called the Formics attack Earth, and this hero Mazer Rackham saves the day. And years later, they're looking for the next great Mazer Rackham, and they run these simulations, and they specifically are looking at children because of I think the way that their minds work and different things, and um, they end up defeating the Formics. I mean, completely annihilating them, uh, and in the process of that, Ender, main character, discovers that something was not a game all along,
Uh,
and he has now committed horrible atrocities. But yeah, so maybe I just gave away too much. I don't know, but that's the movie summary.
yeah.
um, yeah, so I enjoyed the movie, and then I read the books. And so I guess, again, like most things, I can somewhat separate them in my mind and be like, yeah, I like the movie and I really love the books.
Mhm.
I'm that way with Lord of the Rings. People have been asking me a lot about Rings of Power, the series from Amazon. Do you like it? What is it true to the books? And I'm like, honestly, I read the the areas of the book that the TV show covers in about 20 minutes. So
Mhm.
they had to take 20 minutes worth of reading and turn it into 5 years worth of TV. Yeah, I can handle book differences and TV show differences and movie differences, and yet at the same time have my opinions.
Yeah. Now,
Um,
now, some people have. said they don't like the way the books continue after the first book, who are like purists to the
I
first book. How do you feel
Yeah.
about the comparison between earlier versus later books? I have no
Yeah.
opinion in terms of
Um
comparison, but
so I've only read the Ender Saga, and I know, I mean, the author actually went as far as creating a series for some of the other characters.
mm,
Sometimes I feel like that begins to be a little bit of a cash grab. Um I tend to be a little bit more along the lines of like, I think there has to be a completion part. as a as a person who's done creative work, I understand even the desire to keep going. Like, I've recorded several music albums, and it takes me about 10 minutes after I finish said album to be like, well, I'm retiring from music. I don't ever want to do this again. This was torture. It takes me about, another 20 minutes to go, okay, I got an idea for the next one. So it's like, there's that creative process that always just continues, and then you're like, oh, I could do this better. I could add to the story. And I sometimes wonder if series that go on this long um, are part of that. Like, maybe the author was like, oh, I've got more to tell,
mhm.
even though honestly the story is done.
Yeah.
It's reached its conclusion. In some ways, maybe a way to think about this series is you could literally read the first book only and be good to go.
Hmm.
There's nothing left hanging at the end of the first book that I feel like requires a series
Hmm.
to follow.
Yeah, I've been
And so,
satisfied having read it, but
yeah.
I'm somewhat curious about what follows.
Yeah, and it's interesting, but maybe you can just kind of consider it, you know, just extra. In Louisiana we'd call that lanyap. It's just extra. Um Yeah, so I guess kind of as far as the summary, the book contains mostly the idea of what the movie is, although the movie took extreme liberties.
Hmm.
But again, it kind of is that same idea of a simulation being done on children, and they think that they think they're doing a simulation, and it turns out they're actually leading a war.
Hmm.
But it is quite different in the way the war is fought
Hmm.
in the book, pardon, in the book than the movie. I'll say that much.
Yeah, I feel like the best way I put it was I think I would make two changes to how they made it into a movie. I would have made it completely animated,
Yeah.
because then they could age the kids, and I would have made it a trilogy.
Mm.
I think that would have done the book justice. They could have pretty much fit all the essentials in there and had much more of an arc as far as the
Yeah.
journey of the characters. But like, so because basically the book, the kids go from what, 6 years old to what, 12, 15
Yeah, it's I would say Ender to me appears to be about 12 or 13.
by the end. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, Whereas in the movie, basically they're all 12 years old the whole time. And
Yeah.
yeah. And so it's,
And maybe he does. No, you're right. I think the book he does get up to about 15.
yeah. Yeah. Um, I mean, I'm just making adjustments to the bit rate and
Yeah.
experimenting as we go
But you're
behind the
right. In
scenes
the
here.
in the movie it stays it, I mean, there might be a flashback scene in the movie, but that's it.
Hmm.
But he stays about the same age the whole time.
Okay. Yeah. Now, so yeah, so it's a pretty good, solid, compelling sci-fi series. Now, why did we choose this in relationship to Christianity, which we usually do? We usually connect whatever franchise or whatever we pick. We connect it
Hmm.
to our faith in some way, where it either connects or disconnects. Are there themes in the story that struck you as having relationship to your faith or differences, and how does the faith of the author impact that? Because
Mm.
we can talk about what we know about the author's spirituality as we go here, but go ahead.
Yeah. Um, this one's a hard one as
Yeah.
far as, it's hard to really see Ender as a hero, though I don't view him as a villain either, um, because he is being used by the hegemony. It's a hard word for me. Um, to be a hero slash villain.
Hmm.
Um, but at the same time, he kind of is on a hero's journey. Um, it's I'm conflicted on it. I see some sacrifice there.
Uh-huh.
Like he gives his all for the sake of saving humanity.
Hmm.
Um, Little does he know that he's causing atrocities to do it, but
Hmm.
um, you know, you see a very corrupt system that he is kind of sent into, and he tries his best to undo it. He kind of is the um, honestly, in some ways, a sacrificial hero.
Hmm.
Uh, like he's been bred for slaughter in a way.
Yeah.
Definitely that. But I would say for me, there were some themes that I started to pick up on as I read through the book that I was like, you know what? I think that the author is a Mormon. And it was weird because it was, even thinking back, I'm like, I'm not entirely sure what it was that first tipped me off. There was just this general sense of like, I bet you this author's a Mormon. And so I went and Googled it, and sure enough, he was. Is
I found out he mentioned it in the foreword to the edition that I read.
Okay.
And he even went so far as to say, and the symbolism is there if you want to see it. It
Yeah.
was like interesting. I'm not sure what he thinks that means.
Yeah.
I could point to some really literal things and connecting to what I know about Mormon
Yeah.
teaching. But oh boy, this could get complicated quick because we could talk about what we know about Mormonism, its
Hmm.
differences from Christianity, and then just the themes we see, and then we can sort of speculate as to how intentional it was on his part. But where were you headed with that initially, in terms of?
um, yeah, I don't. So yeah, I guess it just adds to the layer of conflict as to whether I see any real good, um, you know, I guess analogies and types and stuff like that with my faith. Um, I would say, like, going into the book, maybe the movie made me think, oh, there could be some things there. But again, by the end of the movie, I kind of knew, you know, the plot twist, at least the movie's version of the plot twist.
Yeah,
Um,
I'd say it was pretty much in line with the book,
yeah,
um, but it was just so much more truncated. It's just
yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
yeah,
They fit some um, massive elements into a very quick, basically the third act or whatever.
well,
You
it's
know,
kind of like the inevitable shortcomings of the Lord of the Rings movies
yeah,
to an extent, in that so much of what makes the book better is the slow buildup
yeah,
of the emotions, and the pressure and the pain that the characters are going through, and the long description the book has of it, of what's being done in their training, quote unquote training, throughout the
hmm,
book, and by the end you feel that weight and the release of it, at the end of the book, and it's like that is all kind of technically in the movie, but it's like boom, boom, boom.
yeah,
So
right,
you can't translate it that quickly. That's why I would. That's why I said, like, unlike Lord of the Rings, I think a trilogy kind of could do justice to Ender's Game, because it is.
yeah,
It's not that long, but there's just more than you could do with 12-year-olds in an hour and a half. You
right, exactly.
yeah.
In some ways, that would be, after reading the book, one of my more negative critiques of the film is just the pacing of it is all wrong. It's so quick,
Yeah.
like you get through major events very quickly,
Hmm.
whereas the book pulls that out longer. I mean, even to the point where there's character development in the books that takes a very long time, of characters that aren't even in the film.
Yeah. Yeah. His siblings are there in the beginning. His sister
Yeah,
a little more. But there's a whole political drama going on Earth while
yeah,
they're doing their training in space, and that whole subplot is gone,
yeah,
which is unfortunate because it is interesting.
yeah.
Um, yeah.
Well, that might does that lead us into the Mormon? Uh,
Okay. Well, I want to know what you felt tipped you off to that. It might be
yeah,
different than me, but go ahead.
yeah. So, and maybe I'm wrong on this, so feel free to jump in and
Well,
correct me.
let me.
But
How about this? I'll give
okay, yeah,
super basic explanation of the, at least as I understand it, some of the core tenets of Mormonism, and then you tell me if that's what
Okay.
you've heard and if it sort of connects at all. But basically, uh, I've heard, like, if you want to know, if you want this more extensively explained, I would recommend James White's ministry, Alpha and Omega Ministries. He's debated Mormons. He's done seminars explaining Mormonism. He's done a lot of Mormon evangelism. Um, but he's broken this down a bit. But one of their core aspects of what they believe is what is called the eternal law of progression, or the law of eternal progression. I don't remember what they're calling it now. It was one of those two, was an original, and then it became the other. But basically, they believe that um, all of us basically have eternal pre-existence, or at least pre-existence. Yeah, but we're all potentially, depending on the path we choose, we all potentially are on a path to godhood ourselves.
Hmm.
And but this applies to all beings, which means that the God we worship, that they worship, um, also used to be a man. Um, and basically, we're all his spirit children. And ultimately, potentially, we all can, if we follow the path of the teaching of their church, we can eventually ascend to populate our own planets, basically, is what they believe. It's actually, and it's a very America centric religion, in that a lot of the scriptures and the history in their scriptures in the Book of Mormon and whatnot, and their interpretations of even, like, they would say they embrace the King James Bible in spite of the contradictions that they would have with it in their further teachings. That their interpretation of scripture actually is very American as well. They see a lot of Old Testament stories having taken place in this region of the earth. And a lot of that, it comes from what I understand, it comes from Joseph Smith, the false teacher, false prophet, who I guess he was sort of in our sort of neck of the woods
Yeah.
in New York, I
Palmyra.
think. Yeah. Um, but those are some. Dragon Fist says, from what I understand, Mormons believe that we're all gods. Well, we all have the potential of ascending to that, but what James White has said is that Mormons share our vocabulary, but they do not share our dictionary. And so you can have actually a conversation with a Mormon and say, like, do you believe that Jesus is the Son of God? Yes. Do you believe he died for your sins? Yes. Oh, well, amen, brother. Well, no, every single thing you just said has a different meaning to them. And so that's super short summary. So there it is. But back to Ender's Game. What struck you in there? Did any of that connect with what struck you in the book?
Yeah, I think in the series you go on to find out that all of Ender's battle mates, fellow soldiers, go on to have their own planets.
Oh, yeah. So very
Which is,
literal. That's kind of what
yeah,
I
like
thought.
that's a pretty blatant one.
Uh huh.
Um,
That's like not even allegory. It's just kind of a literal future vision
yeah,
of Mormonism. It's like, yeah.
yeah. Um, yeah, I think there's some things that I'm trying to wrestle with in my brain to remember if this is accurate of Mormonism, but I believe that Mormonism kind of taught that Jesus and Satan were brothers.
Yes.
And I kind of see that parallel with Ender and his brother,
Yeah.
because his brother is quite evil. Um, Ender writes two books that are bound together as one and kind of become scripture for humanity, which
Huh.
kind of parallels the Book of
Yeah.
Mormon.
Yeah. Ash says,
Uh,
"I'm sorry. What?" Yeah. Well, it's interesting. James White has characterized that sort of exchange and that reaction. If you say that to a Mormon and say, "What? That's so blasphemous to say that Satan and Jesus are brothers." Well, they would, in response to that, probably say, "Well, but we're all spirit brothers." In other words, we're sort
yeah,
of the same species as Christ. He was the physical, literal physical Son of God. They believe God had physical relation, at least historically. I think some modern teachers sort of hedge on this a little bit, but historically they believe that God the Father had physical relations with Mary, and so Jesus was his only son in that that came about in that way. But he is a spirit child of God, but we all are. And so he's our brother, but not in the way the Christian would say Christ is our brother.
yeah,
And then Satan is among those as well, but he became evil. And so it's not like it's not necessarily conflating Satan with Jesus in a way that makes Jesus evil. But anyways, yeah.
Right. Yeah, and sometimes it's not even the explicit things that for me, I can tell certain things. I don't know. There was just kind of a vibe throughout the whole thing.
Hmm.
Um, I read one, not, I don't know, critique is maybe too strong, but one person said that they thought that one of the comparisons was that there's clearly a bent towards uh, filling the earth with many children,
Uh-huh.
and which is kind of a component of Mormonism, and the hegemony and the political structure seems to be against that.
Uh-huh.
So there's this battle of reproduction kind of
That
going
is
on.
interesting. Yeah, it was kind of like the political state of things at the beginning is that like they call Ender a third because like
Yeah.
people generally are not supposed to have more than what, two children.
Yep.
It's kind of like China with the one child policy they had for a while. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, so he's a third, and like, but they risk it because they knew that that he would be a genius, and so they wanted to try again because they needed
Yeah.
to find this general for the child army.
Right.
So that was interesting. And yeah, that's a tricky one because like I kind of there's actually some overlap there with Christianity, although in terms of the history of Mormonism, there were phases in their history. Although mainstream Mormonism has rejected polygamy, it was part of their history.
Yeah.
And so they, in order to achieve this creation mandate, as it were, they had other measures they took that does not overlap with Christianity historically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I believe there's one book in the series too that kind of has a very strong um, attack, almost, if you will, towards what we would consider to be orthodox teaching.
Yeah.
Really, what we've been teaching on with the idea of the doctrines of grace.
Uh-huh.
Really kind of has a
Mormonism. Oh my gosh,
yeah.
it it's interesting. James White's. I don't know what you're about to mention, but I'll say, and then you can tell me what the plot point is. But James White has said that historically with Mormonism, if you look at the way they track out sort of the purpose of the fall, quote unquote, they
Hmm.
see it as the only way that human beings basically could have their agency introduced into the world.
Yeah.
The fall introduces their free will. So it's like the opposite of Calvinism or the doctrines of grace in
Yeah.
that like their salvation history is like definitionally opposed to the idea of God being sovereign over that history.
Yeah.
So
Well,
yeah,
that's where the attack goes.
yeah.
It's very specific against that.
Hmm.
And really to the point where it solos out Calvinism as the problem and leaves all other religions alone.
It's usually how it
You know.
goes.
So, and again, I'm recalling that with a shroud of darkness because I'm just having a little bit of trouble remembering exactly what was said.
Uh-huh.
But I do recall one of the sequels opens with a kind of a blatant attack on the things that we would consider
Hmm.
scriptural.
Right, right. Ash, Ash and James. Ash says James White scares me. Yeah. Well, he's capable of snark. I'll say that. But I have met him a couple times, and he's
Oh,
pretty nice. Although he wasn't afraid to turn his sense of humor on me a little bit,
there you
and
go.
be a little and make fun of me a little bit. But I think behind it is a pretty good sense of humor, and he really loves the Lord and cares about the people he debates and interacts with and stuff. But he knows how to respond in kind if a critic of his goes after his stuff.
Yeah.
So, yeah. But his debates are excellent if you're, up for that. But one theme that this might be worth discussing because I'm not sure how I feel about it. I've been watching. I've watched. We've interacted a little bit with some content from Jordan Peterson.
Hmm.
He's not LDS. I'm not saying that, but there's this idea in Jungian thinking, which is very much a part of Jordan Peterson's influences. The idea of integrating the shadow.
Mm.
In other words, we're and I kind of want to agree with it in one respect, because I think there's particularly when developing a biblical view of masculinity, and there's a righteous use for, I think, our manhood, our aggression, our that very much can manifest in creativity, in leadership, and things like that. And it's not always as gentle, and it wasn't always perfectly gentle with Jesus, you know. So there's a truth in there somewhere, and I think that is a massive theme in Ender's Game. His learning to,
Yeah.
like, he's kind, but he has to be like, he has to learn to absolutely destroy his opponents
Yeah.
to meet his goal at the end of the book. And he doesn't know how to balance that, and it tears him apart throughout the book. Now, with Mormonism, they have a different view, like we mentioned, of the fall. And so that
Yeah.
factors into it in terms of how we relate to our sin nature. And so, how do we as Christians interact with this idea of whether it's manifesting in Ender's Game, however that is understood, how it's manifesting in Jungian thinking, integrating the shadow? What is the Christian version of this, and how is that perhaps distorted in Ender's Game or correct in Ender's Game or things like that? Because, like, yeah, we need to integrate our, the aspects of our life that require aggression, perhaps
Yeah.
require not always being super nice. But the shadow can also be our sin nature.
Hmm.
So how do we discern through life with that, and where did Ender's Game get it right or wrong?
I think with Ender's Game, there's an aspect of it where it's manipulated.
Yeah.
Um, he's manipulated into a state of this by the powers that be.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I don't know exactly what the author's intent with that was. Was the author trying to paint him as just a victim, or was he trying to really deal with the, I guess what maybe Mormonism would teach as far as masculinity? Um, I don't know much about Mormonism and its take on masculinity. I would say, as believers, what Scripture seems to teach us, I've always described as servant-hearted leadership, because I think masculinity is not so much about tone. There will be times when we have to be strong, and we will have to speak strongly. Um, but it's more under the idea of, I don't know, like an iron that's been forged through trial rather than just anger.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that really is clear what I'm saying, but like, um, what is the end result? What is the end desire for our steel backbones?
Mm-hmm.
Is it just to go and commit atrocities like in Ender's Game, where that seemed to be the point of, like, let's break him?
Mm-hmm.
The what's his name, General Graff or something like that. He's just
Yep.
trying to break Ender to the
Mm-hmm.
point where he snaps.
Yep.
And then there's just this violent outburst, where I think, for me, what I see as powerful biblical masculinity is this almost like more of like a foundation. So a foundation is super strong because it can hold weight.
Mm-hmm.
It can bear a lot. And by God's grace, I think of my family. I want to be a guy who bears weight in my family. I want to be able to support my children and be someone that they can rely on, and at the same time stand for the things that are absolutely true, um, and be, you know a rock for them. I want to be able to endure life's trials. I want to
Mm-hmm.
be able to stand in the midst of difficulties, because life is going to throw us many difficulties. So can I stand for what is true, and can I be that rock for my family, and guide them through the ever increasing um, darkness that we face. And I say that kind of tongue in cheek, because I do believe, like in First John, it says the light is pushing back the darkness. So there's a hope that I have foundationally that the darkness will not stand
Hmm.
ultimately against the light, and that gives me confidence. And so, again, that kind of gives me even more confidence to stand on the gospel and stand on truth and be that for my family because I ultimately know who wins.
Hmm.
So um, I'm rambling, but
No.
I think foundationally there's a difference between Christian and gospel shaped strength and masculinity and what the world presents as masculinity and maybe what Mormonism portrays as masculinity, even though I gotta say I don't really fully know what they present.
Yeah, one thing going back to Jordan Peterson's sort of point, something he did say when he was doing some of his, biblical lectures or points. Again, he has some really interesting sort of psychological interpretations of scripture. Sometimes he really overlaps well with basic Christianity. Sometimes it's kind of off the wall. But he did have an interpretation of what meekness really is.
Yeah.
And I think he made a good point in that there's a difference between uh like innocence to the point of naivety versus actual biblical meekness.
Hmm.
He says meekness is not weakness. Meekness is when you're capable of being a monster but you don't exercise it. And that's his
Yeah.
understanding of integrating the shadow in the Jungian sense. Again, that can go off in
Mm.
some unbiblical ways, I suppose. But I think
Yeah.
there's a truth to that in that you are not blind to the ways of the world. You're not blind to
Yeah.
the ways of the enemy. You're not blind to various things. You know that, and you're not trusting of others because uh, you think they'll never sin against you. You are fully cognizant of the risks of serving another person or trusting another person. And you could, but you do it anyway. That's meekness.
Yeah.
That's actual humility is like, and like actual humility is, he defines it like Peterson's interpretation was sort of like, it's actually having a sword in your sheath, but
Yeah.
not drawing it. That's
I
meekness.
I think I've heard it described as um kind of my paraphrase of it. It's strength under the good control of wisdom.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
like um kind of like you said, it's a sword in the sheath.
Mm-hmm.
You know when to draw it and you know when not to.
Mm-hmm.
When someone is under control, especially like a soldier,
Mm-hmm.
who's under control, um, there's a time where it's winsome and
Mm-hmm.
wise to draw that sword. And there's a time, probably the majority of the time, where the sword remains in its sheath.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
I've maybe this is somewhat of a helpful analogy of the opposite. And it actually has nothing to do with the word meekness, but I just thought of this. I've always described the people who are the worst drivers as those who don't know what they're doing. They're the
Mm-hmm.
ones who are afraid because those are the ones who are going to like run you off the road, or maybe they're going to drive 10 miles per hour in a 65 zone. And I think the same actually holds true for guns.
Mm-hmm.
The people who are the most dangerous with guns are the ones who don't respect them.
Right.
They're the ones who injure themselves. Someone who respects guns, who owns them properly, is not going to use them to go commit a mass shooting.
Mm-hmm.
They're not. That's not the type of people that do that.
Right. I've
Um,
heard there was a study done that those who that legal gun owners are more law abiding than police officers.
that wouldn't surprise me.
um, yeah. Okay. I think we hit some good themes there. Any other overarching things you want to touch on or closing
Not,
remarks regarding
yeah,
the
just a
story?
closing remark because it's not thematic.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of dawned on me, I think, with one of the films we talked about recently that kind of went this route as well, where it was like, how can you? Oh, it's The Matrix. How can you justify watching it and at the same time be like, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad, or this is anti-Christian? Um, there's a lot of stuff about Ender's Game that I just find enjoyable.
Yeah.
Um, to me, with a lot of fiction and things like this, especially science fiction, there's a lot of it that I just have to set on the level of enjoyment. and leave it there. And so for me, Ender's Game falls into that category. It's
Hmm.
like there's some things I have to disagree with the author.
Yeah.
But because it's a work of fiction, it's not the most popular series in the world. I don't lose a lot of sleep over it.
Hmm.
Um, maybe with something like The Matrix, especially Matrix 4, it requires a little bit more careful viewership and
Worldview
wise thinking.
discernment. Yeah.
I think for the most part, when you read through Ender's Game or watch Ender's Game, I don't see a lot of people taking Ender's Game as like a literal like, oh wow, there's a lot here for me to live out in my life.
Mm.
It to me it falls more into the category of just kind of mindless entertainment,
Yeah.
which is terrible because we're analyzing it, and that's a good thing.
Yeah. I mean, I think maybe I got a little more out of it thematically than that.
Yeah,
Just in terms of, uh, again, the develop of Ender's character and um his learning to exist among his peers as the smartest one there.
yeah,
Because I'm always the smartest one everywhere I go. No, I'm kidding. No, that's not what I meant. That's not what I meant. But I mean, in terms of, I did often feel growing up like I was the
mm,
outcast, and that was
yeah,
that's the feeling you get throughout the book. And uh, sort of learning to process that and socialize and take leadership in the midst of that.
yeah,
I think there's some useful things there.
yeah. I
Uh,
guess I hadn't even thought about that part of it.
yeah. So it was kind of like my experience going through Harry Potter a little bit in
Yeah,
like you can read into some possibly non-Christian uh response. Like you talked about like the overarching him being manipulated by others to bring it out. Um I don't know, that's kind of twisted and that's not how it usually works. But there's I don't know, if you stretch a little bit, I suppose you could see the idea of God having an overarching sanctification he does in us.
yeah,
That everything we're going through actually is on purpose for,
yeah,
by someone. Um, and it is pushing us towards a certain goal. Um, and so there's some interesting stuff in there. But again, if you go the Mormon route, it's very much opposed to probably. I don't know if this is I don't know if this is an inconsistency on the author's part, in that he intentionally made it kind of like God pulling the strings, but he also is very much against the theology of that.
yeah,
So I don't know.
yeah.
But but yeah, those are at least a few thoughts. I don't know.